Greetings, Cornerstone family. It's good to be back with you again, and I hope you had a good Thanksgiving break and enjoyed your time with your family and so forth. I know we still have some folks traveling, and I apologize for the lateness of this video. I had a little dilemma last night and wasn't able to get it filmed, but we'll get this out today. And before we get back into our study of 2 Kings, I wanted to just remind you to be praying for some folks in our church. We have actually several now dealing with cancer in their families, and so I want to make sure we remember these folks. We've got Mike Causey's mother who was just diagnosed, and hers is pretty far advanced, although I did hear a couple of nights ago that they say it's treatable, so I don't know what that means exactly, but pray for Shirley. We just baptized Matt Ayer's sister, Margaret, who's recently diagnosed with leukemia. Now hers is a slow-moving, and they think it's going to be treatable. So she's encouraged by that, but we need to pray for Margaret. Of course, we have Brother Dennis Cox, who you folks got to hear last Sunday, and we have Sonia Essig, who's still recovering. And now I've just learned that Earl Wilson's mother has been given maybe 3 months or so to live, and so she's battling cancer as well. So it's an insidious disease, and as one of my professors used to say, you know, we need to pray for people with cancer, but we also need to be praying for a cure. So I hope you'll do that and remember these folks. I do know, too, that George Lord's mother had a fall recently, and we need to be lifting her up as well. So it's a lot of other prayer needs, obviously, always in the church family. So pray for one another. Pray for those who are having a hard time getting out right now with COVID and just the various things that we're facing. And so remember all these different prayer needs. Now, I look forward to being back with you Sunday, but I wanted to continue today with our study in 2 Kings, and we're going to wrap up this study of the life of Elijah probably next week. The message today is easily a two-parter, and so we're going to have to be careful with our time today. And so I'm going to cut it into two as we really deal with the last episode of Elijah being on the scene in 2 Kings chapter 2. Now there's 25 verses in this text. I'm only going to get down through verse 13 at the most. So let me read this to us from 2 Kings chapter 2, and then we'll talk about it for a few minutes. And it came about when the Lord was about to take up Elijah by a whirlwind to heaven, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me as far as Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. Then the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that the Lord will take away your master from over you today?" And he said, "Yes, I know. Be still." Elijah said to him, "Elisha, please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to Jericho." But he said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So they came to Jericho. And the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho approached Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that the Lord will take away your master from over you today?" And he said, "Yes, I know. Be still." Then Elijah said to him, "Please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." And he said, "As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. Now the 50 men of the sons of the prophets went and stood opposite them at a distance, while the two of them stood by the Jordan. Elijah took his mantle and folded it together and struck the waters, and they were divided here and there, so that the two of them crossed over on dry ground. When they had crossed over, Elijah said to Elisha, "Ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you." And Elijah said, "Please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." He said, "You have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if not, it shall not be so." As they were going along and talking, behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, which separated the two of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha saw it and cried out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." And he saw Elijah no more. Then he took hold of his own clothes and tore them in two pieces. He also took up the mantle of Elijah that fell from him and returned and stood by the bank of the Jordan. He took the mantle of Elijah that fell from him and struck the waters and said, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" And when it had struck the waters, they were divided here and there, and Elisha crossed over. Now, I actually read through verse 14, but we won't get that far today. Let me just begin by making a general observation. It really seems odd to me that the more our culture seems to embrace atheism and secularism, materialism, and so forth, all of these things point to the absolute and utter meaninglessness of our existence. If we are the product of random chance in a random universe, then our very existence is by definition meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. And the only meaning that we can have is the meaning that we try to assign to our own lives. And so you see this with people in our culture and our world now, and they talk a lot about, especially with young people now, you see it a lot. They talk about changing the world or leaving a legacy or living a life that counts and all those things. And that just seems really incongruous to me. I understand that people have to have some level of meaning in their lives. And so in the absence of God, they create their own meaning. That's understandable. It's just the inconsistency of it that people don't seem to see that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It's like whistling in the dark and pretending everything is okay when you know it's not. Now, on the other hand, Christians, it seems, so often, way too often, have just retreated into their churches and disengaged from the world. And often this happens because they're guided by this notion that life is all about getting to heaven when you die. What we do here really doesn't matter that much, except as it helps to get us to heaven. And so we just kind of back off and don't worry about changing the world. We don't care about things like the environment because, after all, Jesus is coming and we're not going to be here. We don't speak too much about things like changing the world or leaving a legacy. And that's really odd because if anybody should be speaking this way, it should be us as believers. If anybody should be talking about changing the world or leaving a legacy or embracing those notions, it's us who understands that there are eternal consequences to everything that we do. Now, why Christians have done this, I think there are a lot of reasons for it. Discouragement, fear, a lot of times people just feel inadequate and so forth. But the bottom line is there's just this real incongruity in the way that we think about our legacy and the way that the world seems to think about leaving a legacy. And the neat thing about this text is we get a really good glimpse through this chapter about how leaving a legacy works. How does that happen practically and functionally? And we get a glimpse as Elijah passes from the scene and Elisha takes up his ministry and continues it. And he moves it beyond even what Elijah had accomplished. We get, I think, a glimpse of what it means to leave a legacy and how that works. And it really works by doing what our church has really said we want to commit to doing, which is making a disciple or disciples that carry on the work after you're gone. And so disciple making and all of us becoming a disciple making people is crucial for us if we want to think about leaving a legacy in the world. Okay, it's not just about what we do, it's about preparing for the time when we aren't here anymore. And we'll get to see some of that in this text. Now, we're going to get a glimpse of how it happens today as Elijah passes from the scene and Elisha takes up his ministry and so forth. But we won't get completely through this. But I will say this is a pattern that we see in Scripture, a pattern of someone taking up the mantle of the person who came before them and carrying their ministry forward. And that's a pattern that carries over in the New Testament, and we'll get to see that later, probably not until next week. Okay, so a lot of our application here is going to come next week, so you'll need to do both of these messages. But now let's just review, just very, very briefly. 1 Kings, as it ends, Ahab is dead. His son Ahaziah reigns in his place. We won't get to Jezebel really again until like chapter 8 of 2 Kings. So she's sort of in the background here as what you would call the queen regent, right? Her husband is dead, but she still sort of reigns as queen. Her son Ahaziah is on the throne. His reign is short and it's evil. And because he has no son, when he dies, as he did in the end of the last chapter, his brother, Ahab's other son, Jehoram, becomes king. Now, this is a little bit confusing because right now Judah also has a king named Jehoram. So it's a little bit confusing if you're reading through the text and you see that name Jehoram as king of both places. It's just two different men with the same name. But what we'll see as we move on through is Jehoram is going to be the last of Omri's line. Omri was the ancestor that started Ahab's family lineage. And it's going to be the end of Omri's line, the end of Ahab's family line as well. And the judgment that Elijah has been prophesying is going to be carried out ultimately on the family through Elisha's ministry, and we're going to see the end of Ahab and Jezebel's line. Okay, so how does this work? Well, we're going to see two things here. We're going to see the ascension of Elijah in verses 1 through 13. That's all we'll have time to get through today, if even all of that. And then in the second half, we're going to see sort of the ascension of Elisha as the preeminent prophet in the land. So we'll get to see both of these men. So let's look verses 1 through 13 as much time as we have to get through today. These first 13 verses are one of those instances where the significance of the big picture might actually be a little easier to see than what's happening in just the narrative of the text, the text's literal meaning. Clearly, when we see Elijah passing from the scene and Elisha getting ready to take up his mantle, we're meant to be reminded of Moses and Joshua. And as we started this study, we pointed out some things where there are similarities between the relationship of Elijah and Elisha and Moses and Joshua. So we're meant to think about that. But this also points us forward to the relationship between John the Baptist and Jesus. John the Baptist comes along as a precursor. Jesus comes along and fulfills the ministry that God's given him. And it's also could be a parallel to Jesus and the church. Because as we see, when Jesus passes from the scene in the book of Acts, Jesus leaves his church with a mission, and they carry on the work. So Jesus' ministry doesn't end when he ascends into heaven. The church carries on the ministry of Jesus in the power of the Spirit. So here's this pattern, Moses and Joshua, Elijah, Elisha, John the Baptist, Jesus and the New Testament church. All these relationships are parallel, okay? And that's pretty easy to understand. These are just big picture things. It's just a pattern that we see in Scripture of when one major figure passes, there's a disciple who comes along and picks up the mantle and carries on the work, okay? So that's pretty easy to get. But what we see in the actual text feels a little stranger to us because there's some sort of strange things that take place here as Elijah is passing from the scene in this final section of narrative. So the first thing we see is kind of this farewell tour of Israel, which I'm going to speak of in terms of the summation of Elijah's life. Elijah's carrying on here, confirming at the end of his life the same ministry and mission that he's been carrying out throughout his life. So the way we see that is through this strange route that Elijah takes before his ascension. He's moving from city to city, and you see it 3 times here. God tells him to go somewhere. He says to Elisha, you stay here. God sent me on, and Elisha says, no, I'm going to stick with you. As long as you're alive, I'm staying with you. And so you see in Elisha this real drive to be Elijah's successor and to follow Elijah to the very end. But what Elijah's doing is he moves in almost a circular pattern from Gilgal, west over to Bethel, back over to Jericho near Gilgal, and then east of the Jordan. So he basically circles the land and then goes out of the land as he crosses the Jordan River. Now, that pattern may not mean anything to you if you don't know the geography. But what's happening is he's starting in the land, he's moving kind of throughout the land, and then he comes back to the Jordan and crosses out of the land. Now that is a crucial pattern here, and let me show you why. The cities that he moves through, okay, Gilgal, Bethel, and Jericho, are all cities that were crucial to Israel's initial conquest of the land. In other words, when they crossed the Jordan, you remember they did this on dry land. Moses took his staff, they hit the water. Actually, it wasn't Moses, but they divided the waters of the Jordan. They carried the ark over on dry ground, and Israel crossed over into the land. And the first place they came was Gilgal. Okay, this is the place that they camped when they first entered into the land. Back in Joshua 5, verses 1 through 12, you can read that. In fact, it's at Gilgal that the men of Israel are first circumcised, and they celebrate the very first Passover in the land. That's at Gilgal, and that's where Elijah starts. Then he moves west to Bethel. Now, Bethel is near Ai and associated with Ai. And if you remember, Ai was destroyed during the conquest, and Bethel was destroyed with it. You see that in Joshua chapter 8, verses 9, 12, and 17. And so then they come to Jericho, which he comes back to Jericho, which was the first major battle of the conquest. So each of these cities kind of figured prominently in Joshua's entry into the land and the conquest of the land. So why is Elijah doing this? Well, like so many other things we've seen in 1 Kings, what we're seeing is the reversal of the conquest. Now remember, we have said that Ahab essentially re-Canaanized the land. They come into the land, God says, I want all the Canaanites out of here because they worship false gods, and you're going to worship them too if you let them stay in the land. So they drove them out, but they didn't drive them out completely. And they did exactly what God told them they would do. They started intermarrying. They started adopting some of the gods of the Canaanites, the Baals and the Ashtoreths and so forth. And before long, you have an Israelite crew, an Israelite nation that looks like the Canaanites. Yes, they have the worship of Yahweh, and yeah, they have the temple, but they've mixed it with the worship of Baal and Ashtoreth. So they've got a hodgepodge of, they were used to many gods in Egypt, so why couldn't you have more than one God in the land? And that's what they did. And so Ahab encourages this with the northern kingdom and essentially turns the Israelites back into Canaanites. And what does God do with Canaanites? He kicks them out of the land. That's what happens to them. So Elijah's path is a reversal of Israel's entry into the land. He mimics. He comes into the land at Gilgal just like Israel did. He goes to Bethel just like they did. Then he goes back to Jericho and reverses course and goes back out of the land. So this is meant to be an image of Israel coming into the land and going right back out of it. He is portraying what's about to happen to Israel by the end of his life. So think about what happens here. He goes to leave the Jordan, and how does he part the waters? Well, he rolls up his mantle, which is his cape, his cloak, and something he would wear as an outer garment. He rolls that up and he hits the water with it, and the water parts. Now, Moses had done that with the staff to part the waters of the Red Sea, and Israel walked through on dry land. That was the Exodus. Now, Elijah's using this rolled up mantle, and it's another exodus, but this exodus isn't a good one. This exodus is a bad one. This is an exodus of the people from the land in exile. And this is what Elijah is showing them. This mantle that he's wearing is the same one he had on when God appears to him on Mount Sinai and promises judgment on Israel. And you can go back and read about that back in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 15 through 18. So he's wearing this mantle, and it kind of becomes his symbol of prophethood. And he wears this mantle, the thing that he uses to part the waters, to show that he is sort of like the rod of Moses incarnate. He is the rod of judgment bound up in a human person. So as Elijah and Elisha cross the Jordan, we're getting a preview of the exile that Israel's going to experience when Assyria comes in 722 and carries them out of the land. Now, this is what he's been preaching his whole life, his whole ministry. Since God has called him, he has been saying to Ahab and to the people of Israel, you need to choose whom you're going to serve. And if you continue to serve these Baals, you're going to bring judgment down upon the nation and upon yourself. And that's what he's showing here in his last action. So this is really the summation of his life's work. Think about it. When you do something your entire life, you don't want to come down to the end of your life and by your actions or your words repudiate everything you did in your life. I've seen that happen, and so have you probably, in different circumstances. I've known professors, for example, who taught and preached the truth for many years, and then they start following some latest fad or some new sort of heresy that comes along, and by the end of their life, they're repudiating everything they taught earlier on in their lives. I could call names of men who have done that, or men who walk away from the faith. We've seen that recently with some high-profile defections from Christianity. This is the exact opposite. What Elijah does at the end of his life, through the actions, through this acted-out parable of exile, is just confirm the message he's been preaching his whole life. That repentance is necessary, or God is going to come in major judgment, and you need to turn back to Yahweh. And so that's a good reminder for us of what our lives ought to look like, right? How our faithfulness should look. And I wonder if we'll be found that faithful to the end. In Scripture, you think about a text like Hebrews chapter 3 or other texts where Christ points us to the necessity, or the Bible points us to the necessity to endure to the end in order to be saved. The faith that saves is the faith that continues on to the end of life. And so, hold on, excuse me. Pardon me. This change in weather has affected my sinuses. And so, this carrying on our mission until the end, carrying on our faith firm to the end, are we going to do that? Are we going to be as zealous at the end of our lives for the ministry that God gave us at the first or earlier in our lives? Or are we going to succumb to burnout and lethargy and distraction, and as is sometimes the case? I remember the story that one of my professors told me about his dad's last words to him on his deathbed. His father said to him, "Son, don't forget that most men make their greatest contributions to the world after the age of 50. Don't quit, don't burn out, and don't give up. Finish your race." So this is a really powerful message for us. And I think what we're seeing with Elijah here is a reminder. Now, after this, in verses 9 through 13, we see a welcome to Israel's new prophet, okay? And you've got in Elisha the continuation of a ministry and the beginning of a new conquest. Now, this is a little longer than I want to get into right now, so I'm going to save this for next time, and we'll pick back up here next week. So what we've seen here is sort of a farewell tour of Israel, the summation of Elijah's life, and now we see the welcome to Israel's new prophet. When Elisha comes back on the scene, crosses back into the land, we're seeing the beginning of a new conquest. And I'll just end by saying this. Anytime we see a reversal of the conquest in these prophetic books, we see God setting the stage for a new conquest. And we'll get to talk about that some next week. So we'll pick back up here next Wednesday with verses 9 through 13 and move on ahead if we can. And we'll finish out this chapter and probably be done with our study of Elijah. May jump forward and cover the death of Jezebel, because we kind of don't want to leave that hanging. And that should carry us through to the end of the year. So I look forward to seeing you back next week and hopefully seeing you Sunday. As I say, Kara and I were thankful to get some time away with the family up in Tennessee. We're glad to be back, and we're looking forward to our celebration of Christ's coming that we'll be doing over the next month or so. Christmas Eve service, you'll be hearing more about that this Sunday. We are going to do a Christmas Eve service. So just remember all these things. Remember to pray for each other, and I look forward to seeing you soon. God bless, Cornerstone family, and I love you.